political theory can be best analyzed in terms of examining various types of thought, modes of philosophy. The first type set forth by Plato was the idealist school of thought, and we characterized that in the last discussion of Hobbes in terms of Plato's commitment to an ideal of virtue, of justice, because Plato thought that human nature, above all, being rational, was capable of something higher and better and truer than the mere civil war, the awful civil war that he experienced himself during the Peloponnesian War in Athens in the 5th century BC. The other school of thought that we discussed with Hobbes last time is the realist school, and that was announced first by Machiavelli, but carried to its fullest expression by Hobbes. Machiavelli set forth in his realism, as we saw in an earlier lecture, a concept of human nature that was the lowest imaginable. Human beings, from Machiavelli's point of view, were, to use his words in chapter 17 of The Prince, rotten. They were sinful, they were so self-interested, they were capable only of greed. Hobbes takes that concept of human nature and runs with it. In the introduction that I mentioned last time, he says this about humans. The characters of man's hearts are blotted and confounded as they are with dissembling, lying, counterfeiting, and erroneous doctrines are legible only to him that searcheth hearts. From Hobbes' point of view, Machiavelli hadn't searched far enough or deep enough. Those words are direct from Machiavelli. Machiavelli called individuals dissemblers and liars and cheaters and all the rest. That was his proclamation about human nature in chapter 17 of The Prince. Hobbes, though, as we saw last time, isn't satisfied with that. Certainly human nature is characterized by lying and dissembling and cheating and all the rest, but there has to be a more profound explanation. And the profound explanation goes to Hobbes' interest in science, an interest that Machiavelli didn't have, an analysis of political behavior on the basis of an empirical examination, which Machiavelli really didn't have. An examination of human nature, though, that, as I argued last time, is infused with real sympathy, that is, with a way of thinking about individuals that's trying desperately to get them out of this mess. The mess being specifically that of civil war, of widespread violence. Now, I said at the beginning that political theory can be analyzed in terms of three groups of, or modes of thought. The realist and the idealist, Plato on the one hand, Machiavelli and Hobbes on the other. And then there's the reformist, and we'll be talking about that when we discuss Locke, because Locke is an archetypal example of a reformer. What is it about the reformer that is so different from both the realist and the idealist? And further, how are the realists and the idealists, in a certain sense, more alike than the reformers? We can explain that, I think, by looking at an historical fact, and that is the way in which Hobbes, in 1628, chooses to, as his first serious work, translate Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War. Now, you'll recall that Thucydides, a military general in Athens, wrote this brilliant, unforgettable, unprecedented history that perhaps still stands certainly as the outstanding historical work of any war at any time. Thucydides, perhaps as a general, knew what he was doing, but at any rate he had uncanny insight. And he manages to describe an historical situation that Plato found himself in, and that Hobbes goes back to analyze. Because from Hobbes' point of view, as he says in the preface to this translation, Thucydides is the most politic of all historians. He knows just what he's doing. He has an insight that is extraordinary. Now, what we want to do for a moment is to think about the contrast between Hobbes and Plato in responding to the Peloponnesian War, and the way in which Hobbes comments on Thucydides and the way in which Plato responds to Thucydides. The Peloponnesian War, one of the great crises, but more than that, one of the most profound civil wars of our time. Hobbes chooses that as the text to analyze his own experience in his own civil war. Plato looks at the Peloponnesian War, grows up as a youth during the Peloponnesian War. Plato born in 428 BC, and the history of the Peloponnesian War, written in 404 BC by Thucydides, reflecting back then on that period. Plato looks at the Peloponnesian War and responds to it in the way that I indicated last lecture on Hobbes, and that is, he sees a way out of that situation, of that crisis, in a sense that is profoundly similar to what Hobbes sees. That is, Plato looks at the war, sees the civil war as the worst possible situation, predicament, horrendous state of violence that individuals can get into because the Spartans are at the throats of the Athenians. This is a true war. This is destroying Greek civilization. Indeed it did. Plato looks at that, sees the sense of crisis there, a crisis at a physical level, a crisis at a systemic level, but most of all, Plato says it's a crisis at a spiritual level. That is, people in the midst of this war are losing their sense of identity. They're losing their ability to be in touch with basic values, and we must reconstruct a whole new set of values in order to cope with the devastating loss of traditional values that the Civil War has brought on. What do we do, Plato says? We need two things. We need leadership of a first-rate kind, a rational leadership that will be able to show us way out, leadership that has been produced by a system of education. And then we need a concentration of power at the top in our state that will be able to resolve the problem. If we can cope with the Civil War and the recurring mess that we're in any way, it will be as a result of leadership transformed into rational, effective leadership through a system of education and a powerful state. Hobbes, when he translates the Peloponnesian War, couldn't agree more with this prescription. That is, for all of his difference with Plato, he is wholly at one in terms of, first, we need strong leadership, and we need concentration of power in the hands of a few. In this case, even fewer than Plato foresaw. How are the reformers different from this? How will Locke differ from this when we analyze Locke? How will we try to describe the difference between the reformers, and Aristotle I would include among the reformers, by the way, and the liberals, of which Locke is one of the key progenitors. The reformers look at a situation, the same situation. That's the ironic part. They look at a civil war as Locke reflected back on the civil war of his time, and come up with an entirely different diagnosis and prescription. The reformers look at the situation and say, it's not really that bad, Hobbes. It doesn't need the radical surgery that you've diagnosed. After all, we have institutions, and these institutions are viable, and we can build a legal system as a result of them. We don't need to concentrate all power in the hands of a few. And exactly the way Aristotle responds to Plato, Locke will respond to Hobbes. That is, precisely in the same manner. Aristotle says to Plato, cool it. There's no emergency here. There's no great crisis here. Rather, there is stuff we can work with, and we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's keep our institutions. Let's make sure that we have the viable state that we do, and above all, let's not give all power to a few, because sure enough, if you invest power in the hands of a few, whether that few may be the guardians in Plato's Republic or the sovereign in Hobbes' Leviathan, whatever we do, those few will sure enough be corrupted by power, and they will turn into despots. We will get then out of your diagnosis not a better state, not a more secure order, but a tyranny. And Plato has no response to that, nor does Hobbes. But it's at the heart of the contest between, on the one hand, the realists and the idealists, who happen to be together on this point. That is, there is a crisis, let's go for it, let's build a powerful state. and the reformers who say we have institutions that must be respected. We have a dispersal of power that must be continued. We have a way of dealing with the situation that must not yield to arbitrary power in the hands of a few. What do we want then from the reformers' point of view? We want liberty. We want diversity. We want dispersal of power. We don't want the kind of organic community that both Plato and Hobbes are arguing for. Well, that suggests, in terms of political theory then, where we're going. When we look at Hobbes's solution, there is, in a striking way, a fundamental similarity with Plato, and yet extraordinary differences. The differences, as we'll see, will be the whole idea of the contract, which is Hobbes' ingenious device and creation. And the difference further will be the precise terms of sovereignty, the powers given to the sovereign. And as we said last time, the difference is, too, that the sovereign is not a result of education. The sovereign is a result of a contractual agreement among individuals who are truly desperate. But the sense of crisis is there in both Plato and Hobbes. In both of them, they begin with that perception. This situation is terrible. And we look especially to their reaction to civil war. Hobbes says civil war, not just war, but civil war is the worst of all evils, and Plato couldn't agree with him more. And when Hobbes translates the Peloponnesian War, we have an exact parallel then between 17th century England, from Hobbes's point of view, and precisely the historical context that Plato is in himself. That is, Hobbes is writing about Plato's period. But from Hobbes's point of view, it's a different situation. Plato looks at that situation, looks at Pericles, who is the general that got Athens into the war, beginning in 431 BC. Pericles, the author of that magnificent funeral oration that explained to Athens the justification for the war. Plato looks at Pericles and says, it's fine, he's a sensible person, but he's a military general, and we don't want military generals on top. We want an educated philosophical elite on top, and we're going to get it. Hobbes looks at Pericles. He sees him as a military general. He says the problem is Pericles died early in the war. He was killed, or he died during the epidemic of plague in 429 BC. And if Pericles had only lived, he was going in the right direction. Pericles, from Hobbes's point of view, poured authority, charismatic, effective authority into that situation and did the best that he could. And if only we could have had a string of Pericles. But Hobbes says the problem was deeper than that. There was no contract, and there was no sovereign of the kind that he's recommending. So when we go now to the Leviathan, let's keep in mind these points. First of all, the way in which Hobbes sets forth, I think, the finest, most eloquent, but above all, the most logical and systematic statement of political realism that we have. Hobbes goes much further than Machiavelli in terms of his analysis of human nature, in terms of his theory of leadership, his concept of the contract, his all-embracing idea of the sovereign. He takes Machiavelli's realism and develops it. But in all this, he's making a profound response to Plato. And what we want to see now, as we go to his solution, is how dramatically different his solution is from Plato's, how there are some similarities. But what we want to see above all is the dialogue between the two, because that's the real excitement of political theory. When individuals from opposite points of view, reflecting on an identical historical situation, Hobbes making the parallel between Athens and his own, carry on this kind of conversation, carry on a real debate over what course of life is best and whether or not one form of action will be better, more effective than another. Whether justice matters, whether security is in fact our ultimate concern, what kind of leadership we should have. Enduring concerns of political philosophy, concerns that resonate today, even though we have no one, unfortunately, like Hobbes, to articulate them, concerns that deserve, because they are so profound, the systematic, the logical treatment that Hobbes gives them. Now, I said last time that Plato discarded or had no idea of the contract. That was not dealing with Plato's theory adequately. That is, Plato did set forth a theory of the contract, albeit thin, and he does reject it, but nevertheless it is there. In the Republic, he has his character Glaucon, who we met we met when we lectured on Plato, and Glaucon set forth, in the context of that lecture, you might recall the myth of Gyges. Glaucon has a sophist approach to philosophy. Glaucon is the first in political philosophy, in the context of Plato's Republic, of course, to express the idea of a contract. And he does it in an interesting form, it seems to me, that is, early on in the Republic. Remember, the whole debate is over what is justice, whether justice is grounded in an eternal set of values, or whether justice is rather just, from the sophist point of view, a convention, an expression, a part of a few of what they happen to think right, and what they happen to think right today will be different tomorrow, and there's no, from the sophist point of view, immortal, enduring, eternal sense of justice. Well, Glaucon is presenting this point of view, the sophist point of view. And he says to Socrates, "Listen, Socrates, and I'll begin with my first point. I'll explain to you the nature and the origin of justice." Now, we needn't go into the whole explanation that Glaucon sets forth. We want to zero in specifically on his concept of the contract. He says, "Those who have not the power in my state of nature to seize the advantage and escape the harm decide that they would be better off if they made a contract, neither to do wrong nor to suffer it. Hence they began to make laws and covenants or contracts with one another, and whatever the law prescribed they called lawful and right." So, Glaucon says, justice is accepted as a compromise and valued not as a good in itself, but for lack of power to do wrong. No man worthy of the name who had that power would ever enter into such a compact with anyone. He would be mad if he did. That, Socrates, is the true origin and nature of justice, according to my account, and such the circumstances in which it arose. And notice the assumptions behind this. The key assumption, of course, is that we explain the nature and origin of justice not in the concept of physis, of an eternal moral law. That has nothing to do with it. Justice is not rooted in a set of values that is lasting and transcendental. Values, the idea, as we were saying last time, outside the cave. That's not justice, because the sophists believe that there is no outside the cave, that there is only the cave, and that's it. What is justice, then? Justice originates, from Glaucon's point of view, individuals, desperate, they don't want to get hurt anymore, so they band together and say, look, if you don't inflict harm on us, then let's live together, a contract, join together in a compact, and we'll be able to have a degree of security. That's all it is. It's just lack of power to dominate the other party. It's a way of resolving a situation through law, through agreement. Glaucon says it's no more than that. This is the origin of the idea of the contract, and we'll want to note how Hobbes sees it as similar to Plato. Because from Hobbes' point of view, insofar as we can do anything about the situation we're in, we'll only be able to do it through contrivance, through what he calls repeatedly an artifice, through a convention, through an agreement. We will not be able to do it by appealing to transcendental law or physis or some kind of mystical idea out there somewhere. That's the last way we'll be able to get out of this. And so the contract, from Hobbes' point of view, as Glaucon had indicated, follows a way of thinking, a set of values that is profoundly relativist in terms of morality. There is no ultimate summum bonum, as he says, final good, as the old moral philosophers prescribed. There is only, Hobbes says, a summum malum. And that summum malum is fear of death. Well, Hobbes then sets forth his concept. And we want to note then how, first, it's right in line with the sophists. Relativity of values. There is only one, remember, value system, and that is happiness comes from the satisfaction of more pleasure, unhappiness from pain, and we try to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain insofar as we can. But the human predicament is constantly conspiring against us because we're irrational, sensual creatures. How do we get out of it? Well, as I said last time, we don't get out of it through reason. We're sensual people, we are passionate creatures, we're angry, we're frustrated, we're unaware of this vicious cycle we're in. We don't get out of this by sitting down and suddenly being transformed through an educational system into virtuous types and say, well, we'll resolve this all, let's just come and let us reason together. No, it doesn't work that way. Rather, it works in the way that Hobbes expects it to work best, and that is angry, but above all fearful and anxious individuals say, oh, we've got to get to an agreement on this. And this is where I think it applies to the Middle East. That is, we cannot take it any longer. This must not continue for another 100 years. How do we do it? The contract is among those individuals, not the sovereign, but those individuals who are desperate for a resolution. Now, when Hobbes turns to the contract, the idea of the contract, he begins, this is the preparation for it, with his discourse, his magnificent discourse, on the natural condition of mankind, as he calls it. And he begins that by saying, nature hath made men so equal in the faculties of the body and mind that the weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest, either by secret machination or by confederacy with others that are in the same danger with himself. That's the typical Hobbes. He goes right to the problem. There is such equality among us that we all are literally one another's potential murderer. There is no way we can cope with this situation. We're trying to cope, of course, accumulation, remember, more and more power. We're trying desperately to get more power than the other, but nature has imposed upon us, imposed upon civilization itself, a state in which no one can come up with a means of being absolutely invulnerable, protected absolutely from others. And the Strategic Defense Initiative was supposed to do that while it was on. That is, the maximum shield. We would be protected once and for all. But from Hobbes' point of view, that's unimaginable. There's always going to be another weapon coming up that will devastate the previous one. And so nobody is ultimately safe. Nature has built that in. So, hereby it is manifest, then, that during the time men live without a common power, and we'll want to note how often he repeats this because he's preparing us now for his solution. During the time that men live without a common power to keep them in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war, as is of every man against every man. For war consisteth not in battle only, or the act of fighting, but in a whole tract of time, wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. And therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war as it is in the nature of weather. For as the nature of foul weather lieth not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting always, but in the known disposition thereto. During all the time there is no assurance to the contrary. All other time is peace. Well, there isn't much peace. I think that was, by the way, the best definition of the Cold War. that I've ever encountered. Hobbes had it right in the nose, and that is the way in which war can be defined not as one moment, one hot war only, but rather the anticipation of more and more war. And we're locked into a situation in which there seems to be a recurrent nature of war and no way out. Whatsoever, therefore, is consequent to a time of war where every man is enemy to every man, this is what I call the state of nature. And in this state of nature, what is worst of all is continual fear of violent death. And the life of man in the state of nature, and is one of his most famous lines that I'm sure you've heard before, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That reminds me of New York City. People can criticize me of putting down New York City often, and I feel I can do it because I'm a New Yorker. I've lived there for decades. I know what it's about. That kind, as I was saying in the context of the article before about the rapid increase of guns, rapid increase over the last 20 or 30 years in New York City, that describes it, yes, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It applies to a lot of places, though, not only New York City. As I said, it applies to the Middle East and other areas that are in a constant state of violence and fear of violent death. Now, a number of scholars have pointed out, C.B. McPherson among them in his introduction to Hobbes' Leviathan, is that Hobbes, when he speaks of the state of nature, is not speaking of a period in the past in which we envisage a summa malum back there in not a golden age, but a black age, a dark age. He's not speaking of that. Rather, the state of nature is with us all the time. The state of nature is the abyss. The state of nature is that part of our nature to which we may fall at any moment, and we repeatedly do fall in civil war. We repeatedly fall in Cold War, an aggressive, violent, belligerent situation. That's the state of nature. And so we're constantly on the edge. And some of us are in the pit. But whether we're on the edge or in the pit, the problem is this: there is not a common power to keep us in awe. Now that, from Hobbes' point of view, is the diagnosis of the situation. And that forecasts the way out. Now we want to note here how throughout this part of the Leviathan, and I'm reading now from chapter 13 and into chapter 14, how often he repeats the idea of a common power, leading up to precisely what he's going to prescribe, and that is that the way out is a very huge common power, that is the Leviathan. Repeatedly, before he sets forth his idea of either the contract or the sovereign, he's saying, where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, there can be no justice. The passions that incline men to peace are above all, he says, fear of death, desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living, and a hope by their industry to obtain them. So what's the argument? We want peace, as we were saying before. We're locked into a situation in which, because of our irrational, self-destructive behavior, we can't break out of it. But we do want peace. And as he says, the way out is around the corner. To affirm this idea that we want peace, Hobbes sets up as a natural law this. It's a precept, a natural law, a general rule of reason, he says, that every man ought to endeavor peace, as far as he has any hope of obtaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war, the first branch of which rule containeth the first and fundamental law of human nature, which is, seek peace and follow it. But the second law is the sum of the right of nature, which is by all means we can, when we are in a state of war, defend ourselves. Hobbes is no pacifist. Nothing remotely like it. He believes in self-defense. But the question is how to defend oneself effectively. How then do we ensure peace and defense? That is the question. And we go to chapter 17, the chapter that contains his advocacy of both the contract and the sovereign. Now, this is in part 2 of the Leviathan, as some of you know from having read the book. And in part 2, remember, he's setting forth his solution. We can't have the problem diagnosed in more extreme terms than this. Nobody has beat nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short. There's no political philosopher that has described it in such extreme terms. And remember, this is not something that happened long ago. This is something that's with us now and about to convulse us. So the situation is so desperate that we must come up with the radical surgery. Here it is. If there be attained or accomplished what is required, we must then fashion a covenant to make an agreement among all parties constant and lasting. This covenant must come with a common power to keep people in awe and to direct their actions to the common benefit. Now, 3 points about that quickly, which you noted. One is the way out. First, a contract or a covenant. 2 words are synonymous. Second, the idea of a common power. But notice, the common power does not alleviate, or it alleviates perhaps, but it doesn't eliminate fear. The common power, acknowledging the nature of human nature, that we're fearful and we're going to be fearful in the present, and we're fearful in the present, we're going to be fearful in the future. The common power continues to keep us in awe. It uses the fear in a constructive way, but it doesn't eliminate the fear. Precisely the difference between the realist and the idealist. Hobbes is not saying that we will become rational creatures emancipated from all fear. Rather, our fear will be directed in a certain way, in an effective way, a way towards the creation of the sovereign. And we direct our actions, notice, to the common benefit. That is, common awe, yes, common power to keep them in awe, but the common benefit comes out of this. Now, the only way to erect such a common power as may be able to defend them from the invasion of foreigners. Hobbes is very clear now about what he wants. Civil war, yes, but also defending us from the Spanish Armada and the injuries of one another in civil war, and thereby to secure them in such sort as that by their own industry and by the fruits of the earth they may nourish themselves and live contentedly. The only way, Hobbes says, to do this is to confer all their power and strength upon one man or upon one assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices unto one will. Got it? We must take all of our rights, scoop them all together, all of our powers, get them in one, and give it. Give those powers, give those rights to someone who will represent us for one cause and one cause only: increase the peace. We must in some way attain a sense of balance that will stop the vicious cycle long enough and we go into a point of security. We want to note how often in this one passage Hobbes invokes his common concern 3-4 times in this one paragraph: common peace and safety, peace and common defense, peace and security, over and again. That's what he wants. He's very clear about it. And it's noteworthy when we go through the Republic that we have in Plato very little reference to the aim of keeping the peace or a common defense or security. Everywhere Plato uses the word arete, that is, virtue. That's what we want. Nowhere does Hobbes ever say that virtue, he's had enough virtue. Oliver Cromwell has his virtue, and King Charles had his virtue. Everybody's got their conscience on their sleeves, and they're crying out, "This is my virtue," and that just means more bloodshed. Forget that. We just want agreement on one thing: common peace and security. So we want then to confer all our power and strength on one man or an assembly of men, which is as much to say to appoint one man or assembly of men to bear their person, and every one to own and acknowledge himself to be author of whatsoever he that so beareth their person shall act or cause to be acted in those things which concern the common peace and safety, and therein to submit their wills, every one of his will and their judgments to his judgment. This is more than consent or concord. This is real unity among them all, in one and the same person, made by covenant of every man with every man, in such manner as if every man should say to every man, this is all italicized, I authorize, give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men, on this condition, that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner in the name of peace and security. This done, the multitude so united in one person is called a Commonwealth, a Leviathan, in Latin, civitas. This, then, is the generation of the great Leviathan. In him consisteth the essence of the Commonwealth, which, to define it, is one person, of whose acts a great multitude by mutual covenants one with another have made themselves every one the author. To the end he must use the strength and means of them all as he shall think expedient for their peace and their common defense. Well, he just can't say this too much. Their peace and their common defense. I mean, it becomes a kind of Johnny one-note refrain. It's what he's concerned about. Now, when he sets this forth, let's pick the paragraph apart to get the essence of it. First of all, as we said, people are kept in common awe. So there is no suggestion of reason entering into this. That is, only individuals go into it out of a state of fear, and their fear continues. But more than that, the contract is made among the people themselves, and initially does not, or at no point, includes the sovereign. The sovereign does not sign the contract. The sovereign represents those individuals who make the contract, but the sovereign isn't in the contract himself. Now, why should that be important? Why is it so essential? Because if the contract becomes invalid, if the contract is not legitimate, then those people who sign the contract do not have to consult the sovereign. They just get out of the contract. They are the ones that got into the contract. They're the ones that comprise the contract, and not the sovereign. That's an important point, because we'll see in a moment what would be the cause of the contract being illegitimate, a crucial factor. But for this point, note well that the sovereign then is no more than an individual who is deputized or appointed by the populace to increase the peace. That is the bottom line. Now, what else do we have about this? Well, the common peace and safety, obviously, just constant, as we said through it. That's the key goal. But notice how the individuals authorize the sovereign to take all of their rights and powers. Notice the sweeping nature of this contract. It's extraordinary. Now, for the first time, we have in political theory a state envisaged in which every right is given up. And Hobbes, in the second part of the Leviathan, is very careful to detail each one of the rights that we surrender, each one of the powers that the sovereign has. There is only one power, as we'll note, that he doesn't have, but he has an enormous range of powers. He has all executive power. He has all legislative power. He has all judicial power. So forget any notion of checks and balances. There is concentration of power in the hands of this one person of a kind that there is in the hands of Plato's guardians. There is no limitation on any of this. So when Hobbes argues for an extreme solution, this is it. Is there freedom of religion? Freedom of conscience? Forget that. The sovereign has this power to censure all religious literature, to censor all religious opinions, to hold any individual and without any due process, imprison that individual, put that individual away if the sovereign objects to his religious views or his moral views, whatever else. Now this is one, the next power is a big one, and it will distinguish Hobbes from Locke more than perhaps any other, and that is that the sovereign has the power to distinguish what is public and what is private property. And that is, the sovereign has the power to determine whether what you own is his or not. Now, when Locke read this, as we'll see when we talk about Locke, this is a Briton who is very concerned with his private property, and this is where the line has to be drawn. If Locke had not objected, and of course he would have, to any of the previous powers, this is where it would have come to blows. That is, one must not surrender one's right to private property. Even Machiavelli, remember in The Prince, chapter 17 and after, he says that the prince must be careful not to touch the property of his subjects, neither the property nor the women. Those two together, very important. Why? Because you will make your subjects hate you. Hobbes, reading Machiavelli, forget that. We have this. So, the editor of this volume, it says about these powers, his name is John Plominatz, he taught at Oxford University for decades, political philosophy, and he, after having edited the book, concludes this, even though he puts it in the introduction. Hobbes demolishes in turn all the arguments put forward to limit the sovereign's authority, that there is a spiritual power independent of him, that there are fundamental laws regulating the use of power by which he is bound, that his subjects have a right to disobey him for conscience sake, that they have rights of property which he cannot touch except with their express consent. No one before Hobbes, Plominatz concludes, ever made so elaborate and uncompromising a case for absolute government. Now that's a sweeping indictment of Hobbes. That is he authoritarian? Maybe even a totalitarian, an advocate of such absolute government? I think Plominatz has gone too far. I think that Hobbes reserves very carefully a right that any subject has, and that right is to his own life. The sovereign may not put to death an individual illegitimately. Now, what's legitimate and what's illegitimate? What's illegitimate is to conduct foreign wars that don't threaten the state. What is legitimate is to fight an enemy at one's shores. What is illegitimate is to exacerbate the violence in the world rather than to strive to resolve it. What is illegitimate is to foment a civil war with no real cause. That is, the cause of religion or whatever else was the cause of the English Civil War. What is illegitimate, then, is to involve a polity in constant violence and war. So what, then? What determines the legitimacy of the contract? Whether the sovereign has made it work. Whether the sovereign has served his function. And what is his function? Not just to serve as a demagogue, obviously. His function is to keep the peace. And if he doesn't do that, then each individual in that contract has the right to withdraw from it. Now, that might not seem like any great shakes, because if the first person withdraws, the sovereign has such tremendous power, he can come down and chop him any moment without any provocation. But if the legitimacy of the polis, the legitimacy of the political system hinges entirely on whether or not security is provided, then there is a way of determining whether the sovereign is right or not. And Hobbes has established once and for all this sense of legitimacy. Hobbes has managed to say it is illegitimate to get us into this continuing state of war that we're in. We must use all of our power in order to say peace at any price, yes. But the price is to serve an individual's self-interest, because we all want the peace. We all want order. We just want to we must find a way, whether we speak of New York City or the Middle East or any other place that's in constant state of violence, we must find a way to transform the situation from continuing warfare to a state of peace. We go back to our question in the first lecture, and that is, peace at any price? Is it worth it? Do we want to surrender all of our rights? Do we want to live in a state of common awe? Do we want to give away to a common power, to a higher source, Do we want to surrender, as in the case of Israel or the other Middle Eastern countries? Do we want to surrender all our national sovereignty in order to give to the United Nations, say, complete power, so that the United Nations will, as it was not able to yesterday, for example, resolve the situation by imposing a degree of peace on it? Do we want to do that? Do we want to sell it? Do we want to have some kind of authority in New York City that would make either the present mayor or the previous one look like extreme liberals? I mean, do we want that kind of situation, that kind of solution? Hobbes says, let's be honest with one another. We've had warfare since before the Peloponnesian War. We have a kind of recurrent problem here, don't we? It's a problem that speaks so much to the human condition, taking the life of another individual repeatedly and using any kind of justification for it, whether the justification might be the Crusades or the justification, as in the case of the Vietnam War, that, the North Vietnamese were going to be on the shores of San Francisco if we didn't stop them there. I mean, all kinds of wild and absurd justifications have been used in order to sanction war fought in places that should never have had war. In order to get to the rock bottom consideration, the rock bottom situation is, yes, violence may be necessary. It may be that we will have to defend ourselves. And in that case, let's go for it. Let's defend ourselves all the way and back the sovereign 100%. But in most cases, it's not. In most cases, war is illegitimate. It's sanctioned by any number of causes. In those cases, then, we have to apply a rigid criterion, and that criterion is peace. Peace, yes, at any price. Hobbes' solution is an extreme one. There's no question about it. But do you have a better one? Can anyone suggest a way of ending this chronic problem that we have, tragedy that we have today and for millennia? If anyone can come up with a solution for the recurrent state of violence in civilization after civilization, and say to Hobbes and Hobbes' philosophy, yes, my solution is better than yours, let that person come forth.